Today, we will talk about 3 places people shouldn't have gone to, but went anyways, and it didn't end well. There is this tiny, lush, heavily forested, beautiful island 93 miles off the coast of Brazil that no matter how beautiful it looks, no one will go to this island. In fact, you're not even allowed to go to it, because the Brazilian Navy has forbidden it. The legend of this island began in the early 1900s, when a local fisherman was off the coast of the island and saw right on the edge of the forest these banana trees with all of these bananas that were ripe and ready to be picked. And he thought, I can easily pull up my boat over those rocks, hop out, grab some bananas and bring them home. It will take me 10 minutes. It will be easy. And so he pulls over by himself to get these bananas. He anchors his boat, walks up the beach, and climbs the tree and starts hacking down some bananas. While he's up there, he suddenly feels a sharp pain on his ribcage. He falls out of the tree. He looks down and he's bleeding out of his ribcage. There's blood all over his shirt. Was there a branch that jabbed him in the side? Or was it something else? He's alone, 93 miles away from the mainland. So, in a panic, he ditches the bananas. He runs to his boat, gets it unanchored, and starts making his way back to the mainland. But on the track back, he passes out in the boat. Later that day, another group of fishermen see this boat kind of drifting around near some rocks, and it looks like something is wrong. So, they make their way over to it, and there's this fisherman who went to get the bananas, but he's dead, lying on his back in a pool of his own blood. 20 years after this incident, there was a lighthouse keeper that was assigned to work on this island. He brought his family with him. They were staying in the main house of the lighthouse. It was going fine for the first couple of days they were there, but at some point, captains of vessels that would drive past this island and relied on that lighthouse noticed that the light wasn't on, and so they reported it to the mainland. A search party was sent out to check on the lighthouse keeper and his family to make sure that they have all their supplies and that they were okay. When they get to the lighthouse, they find the entire family is dead in their bed, and the only clue they had were these puncture marks all over the bodies of these deceased lighthouse keepers and an open window. So what killed these people that went to this island? Apparently, they died from a poison that literally melts your organs within 60 minutes of coming in contact with it. But that poison comes from a very famous venomous snake called the golden lancehead viper that only exists on this island. You can't find these snakes anywhere else in the world. This island has been called Snake Island, and since nobody goes to this island, the lancehead viper population has exploded. They are thriving on this island. Researchers say that there's at least 3,000 of these venomous snakes that live on this island, and for every 1 square meter of this island, there's a snake, which means if you're on this island, you're always within 1 meter of something that can kill you. And these snakes aren't just on the ground either, because their primary food source are birds. So the snakes have begun to live in the trees and catch birds that land on the trees, meaning if you happen to be walking on this densely forested island, you'd be surrounded almost 360 degrees by these venomous snakes. And if you were bit, you have 60 minutes to get the antidote. If you don't, you're dead. Nowadays, the only people that go to this island are the Navy, who replace the batteries in the lighthouse, which is now automated because it's too dangerous to be there. They go once a year to replace those batteries. Researchers occasionally go there, and poachers that go to try to catch some of these snakes, because they're so rare, they can sell them on the black market for $10,000 to $30,000. But many of these poachers that manage to sneak onto the island just get bit by these vipers and die. In the early 1990s, a man turns on his camera, flips on his light, and starts filming. As the viewer, all we can tell is that he's in a gray hallway. It's unclear where he is, but it does appear to be something that might be underground because everything seems to be concrete. As he's filming, he begins walking down this narrow corridor where there's nothing on the walls or on the ground or anywhere to give away where he is. And so for the first 40 seconds of him just walking down some kind of meandering hallway, there's nothing much to see. Then at some point, he aims his camera at what it looks like an arrow that's been spray painted on the wall. He looks down at the ground, and there's another arrow. He starts to follow the arrows, and he's filming each one as he comes across them, as he goes farther and farther off of the main hallway. At some point, the arrows bring him to this room, which at first you can't tell what it is. But then, as the camera focuses, you can see that there's this massive pile of human remains, skeletal remains. The guy filming does not seem alarmed by what he's seeing. In fact, it seems like he came here knowing he might come across this room full of human remains. After staring at this room for a few moments, he doesn't go in, but instead turns and continues following these arrows and strange markings on the wall and the ground as it brings him farther and farther down this corridor to more rooms with more skeletal remains, and at some point he comes to a full stop and he's looking at one of these rooms and something spooks him. It's unclear what it is because to this point he's been calm about this horrible thing he's looking at. It didn't seem to faze him at all, but something did spook him because he's standing there and all of a sudden he starts sprinting down the hall. It's clear at this point in the video that he's alone down here, or at least he thinks he is, but he's running as if someone's chasing him and he just takes off down this hall and the camera is now dropped to his side. He's not even trying to film what's in front of him. You hear his breathing, it's very panic, and at some point he kind of trips and drops his camera and the camera comes to a rest in a puddle, looking right up against the wall. So you don't have a clear view of where this guy is or what's going on. All you hear is his panicked breathing and his rapid footsteps as he continues to run down the hallway and eventually just disappears and is totally silent. And at some point, the camera runs out of battery and it turns off. 10 years later, a group of urban explorers would find this man's camera where he dropped it 10 years earlier in one of the scariest places on Earth. Hundreds of feet below the streets of Paris, France, lies one of the world's largest mass graves. It's known as the Paris catacombs. It's about 200 miles of interconnected passageways that loop all over the city of Paris, where over 6 million people have been buried. The reason all of these people were buried down there is because the 17th century in Paris, the cemeteries in the city were overflowing, and so the decision was made to move their bodies down underneath the streets of Paris into these tunnels that were built in the 13th century for mining, but had not been used in hundreds of years. So they began packing in all of these people to the tune of 6 million bodies before they ultimately stopped. Starting in the late 1800s, the catacombs became sort of a popular tourist destination. But only a tiny section of the catacombs was made open to the public, meaning there are literally hundreds of miles of passageways in the catacombs that are totally sealed off to the public. Even though many people believe in these forbidden sections of the catacombs, there are entrances to additional levels of the catacombs, that there could be as much as 400 miles of passageways in these catacombs, just waiting to be explored. But no one is allowed to go in there, at least not legally. There is an entire community of people that are sneaking into the forbidden section of the catacombs by going through sewer drains and getting on the train tracks and sneaking into little cracks inside of the walls. Once people started figuring out how to sneak into the forbidden section of the catacombs, there's been countless of stories of these urban explorers sneaking in, getting lost and never coming out again, which is exactly what we think happened to the guy with the camera who saw the arrows and then ran away. His camera was located miles and miles into one of these forbidden sections. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men, who were from Finland, were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse. It is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of these 5 men had actually done this before, because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel, because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air, which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of this dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel, where all around the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open, and then freezing water would go into your dry suit, and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a real cool dive, but it's also dangerous, and your body doesn't adjust well to having pure oxygen pop into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen. And when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rush it to the surface. There are things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, You need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush it to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy, and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body. You'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation, and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined, and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap, and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going down first. Then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. The pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw. They hop into the beautiful clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into the tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going to the right way, because there's all of these dead-end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go, and they go pretty far out. When you get to the bottom of the 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way, and then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at this point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit, because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues, and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot, and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight was normally right up against him. He couldn't see it anymore. He turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit, because he's trying to get himself free, but he can't move. The lead diver could tell that he's thoroughly wedged into this one little section, and he would say that what he thought happened is that the trapped diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and motorized himself into this wedge. It wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they had such little space to work with, and the trapped diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again, and ends up inhaling water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic, because he will end up burning through his oxygen, and he'll get hypercapnia, and he won't be able to get to the surface, and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body, but he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past this dead body, and they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen. So almost certainly, those 3 divers are going to get here and be trapped and going to die too. Terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading to the surface, and he had to stop at each of these decompression stops, and as he's doing that, he's thinking about how he's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. At some point, he makes it up to the surface. He just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel. They're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the first pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other 2 had even seen it or knew about it. He began to panic, and as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic he moves it around, inhales water, and also drowns. So now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. The second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well he probably doesn't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided he was going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so, on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light, and there's 2 dead bodies. The second diver begins removing pieces of his gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, he pushes himself through with his hand. all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through, and then he put his gear back on. Knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface, and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver who had turned around, gone all the way back to the entrance. He skipped all of his decompression stops as well. He got to the entrance just barely, but when he got there, the entrance was frozen over, and he had to punch his way through the ice, which he was able to do, and he too got to the surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up. He called the authorities and went to the hospital. They would make a full recovery. They told the authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to go down and retrieve their bodies, so they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite, and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such an intense survival skill that they would illegally go back to the Plura cave and retrieve the bodies.